This is like a lot of Frank Capra films. It's a screwball comedy, but it's very different because it's also a dark comedy. Now, it being from the 40s, it's not terribly dark, but it deals with macabre themes and it deals with death in a humorous way. So that's kind of how it is, I guess, dark comedy in that sense. That was something I was a little surprised about when I read about the film and I started watching it. Is just, I guess, not how dark it is, because in today's standards, it's not very dark at all. But I can imagine back then people being a little shocked by what they were watching. But, by today's standards, it's harmless, fairly. It deals with the tropes of the day to a certain extent. People with scars look like monsters and are evil, and people who sound different are insidious, and that stuff, right, as well. And so it deals with the tropes of the day, but it still does it in a fairly humorous way that is enjoyable when you watch the movie. So, and screwball. Let's talk about screwball comedies as well before we get to the review. Screwball comedies is something that from time to time you see nowadays, but it was much more popular between the years of 1930 and 1950. We're talking films like Some Like It Hot, Designed for Living, Bringing Up Baby, My Man Godfrey, a great movie. It Happened One Night, another fantastic movie. These types of films don't really get made anymore because they deal with a lot of it's physical comedy, but it's done in a very silly, kind of not so serious way, and especially with how people are nowadays. They wouldn't exactly work because they do broad comedy, but they do it stereotypically to a certain extent. But it's all in good fun, and it's all in jest to a certain extent. So, yeah, like it's not offensive in any way. To Be or Not to Be is another great screwball comedy. It's not offensive in any way, but for, I guess, people who want to watch comedy with the sensibility of today, yet screwball comedies really aren't something that I think a lot of younger people and people that look for films that reflect themselves to a certain extent will go to. But some of the best comedies are screwball. Like I mentioned, Some Like It Hot is a Stone Cold classic. My Man Godfrey. It Happened One Night. Like today, if you were to watch it, you'd have fun, you would enjoy it, and it would be a great movie. And I kept hearing that Arsenic and Old Lace is like that, except for people who are into dark comedies. So I was fairly excited by the prospect of watching this movie. So let's get into my opinion of Arsenic and Old Lace. I wasn't expecting it to be terribly dark. Like, I'm used to dark comedies like the Coen brothers does dark comedies that they deal with death, but in a humorous way, something along those lines. Those are the type of dark comedies, or comedies that, how would I put this, would deal with serious subject matter in not just a lighthearted way, but just in a comedic sense, where you laugh at kind of the darkness in what's being talked about. Like Brazil, I think, would be a dark comedy to a certain extent, while it also being a satire. But that's what I'm used to with dark comedies. So I was kind of surprised when I watched the film, even though it deals with macabre themes and horror themes, how absolutely lighthearted it was. So that was kind of a surprise when I was watching this. It shouldn't have been. It shouldn't have been a complete surprise because of the time it was made. But I was watching it, and I was expecting it to get mildly disturbing, maybe a little unsettling, and it didn't go that route at all, which is fine. It's not that big of a deal. It's not something I'm going to criticize it for. When I watched it, I was expecting one thing to a certain extent to happen, and it just didn't do it. And that's kind of the thing with screwball comedy too. They want to keep it light. They want to keep it fun to a certain extent. They want you to have a good time, and that's what was kind of weird about this movie, because the story is basically that Mortimer, a drama critic who's also an author, gets married in the beginning of the movie, and he tells us his two aunts that he got married and they're going to go on his honeymoon, and their aunts. And then he finds a dead body in one of his aunt's, a window box of sorts, which sets into motion him starting to find out that his aunts are serial killers. Essentially, they poison what they call sad, lonely men, and have their mentally deficient son bury them in the cellar, who thinks he's Teddy Roosevelt. That's the plot right there. He finds out what they've been up to, and he tries to correct the situation, and it does it with disastrous results to a certain extent. That's the plot of the film. Those of you who have seen Bringing Up Baby know that even though Cary Grant can be a serious, charismatic, likable actor, he is very good in physical comedy. He has no problem, even though he can be very charismatic, being an actor who can humiliate himself, make him look silly, make him look not serious, not likable, kind of like just. The thing with back then, and it's still to this day, if you look a certain way, people want you to act a certain way. And in order to get more popular, you just do what the audience wants. They want you smiling and kissing the heroine at the end of the movie and showing your dashing smile. That's what you do because that's what makes the money. Cary Grant was different. Cary Grant not only did those types of movies, he did those too, but he also did these screwball comedies with a lot of physical humor. And he was very good at it, not just because he can do physical comedy very well, but the juxtaposition of him being so charming and so handsome, doing all these outlandish physical comedy and distorting his face in comedic ways seemed to work very well for him, which was, if I recall reading correctly, that was kind of a surprise for people back then. Now it's not so much, but that's what made him, I guess, pretty popular. He didn't end up getting an Academy Award. He got an honorary Oscar, but okay, no big deal on that one. That thing with Cary Grant is shown throughout the entire movie. His way of doing physical comedy and to act outlandish and act pretty much like unsettled throughout the entire film. And it's done in a good comedic effect. It's funny throughout the entire film, which, again, if you've seen Bringing Up Baby, you know that he can do that, and he does it very well. So, not a surprise. What I became surprised by in certain aspects of the film is when it started getting progressively darker. Sometimes with dark comedies, the dark comedies that have problems. The problem that comes across when it comes to a dark comedy is that when it's time to get dark, either they get too dark or they don't mix well with the lighthearted, not the lightheartedness, but with the humor. You have to find like really dark matter, dark things to be humorous to a certain extent in order to enjoy them. And that's okay with some people. There are some dark comedies that really deal with fucked up things, and some can find the humor in it. But I think really good dark comedies can marry them both to a certain extent, where even when they're dealing with something very screwed up, that it's still, in a sense, humorous. And for the most part, Arsenic and Old Lace does that well. When some characters are introduced, and we'll get to that in spoilers, when some characters are introduced that darken the film to be a little more disturbing, the humor is still there to a certain extent. It doesn't go too dark, but it goes dark enough to fit the setting of what's going on. The performances are pretty good. Of course, Cary Grant is very good in the movie, like I mentioned. The lead actress, Priscilla Lane, doesn't really have much to do in this, but she's good. She's just a lovable. She's just a lovable now wife of the main character, who gets sidetracked throughout the entire film, and that's fine. She did good for what she had. Raymond Massey was actually very good as Mortimer's brother, Cary Grant's brother in the movie. And even though he's supposed to be a more serious character, he plays the performance pretty well for a comedy. And that was one character that I was afraid when I saw it that it would veer too dark and might have an issue, but it didn't happen. What I want to point out, though, it's a good performance, is Peter Lorre as Dr. Einstein. Peter Lorre, I'm used to seeing him as a screwed up character, morally bankrupt, disturbing. The one that I think is his best performance is the movie M, which was a German film in the 30s. I believe it's the 30s, where he played a child killer. And that's what I know him for. To see him doing this movie in a comedy and it working pretty well was a bit of a surprise, and it actually was done very well by him. And that performance was a fun performance, even though he was pretty much playing the Igor to Raymond Massey's character to a certain extent. But it's a good performance. And the two women who played the aunts, which is Jean Adair and Josephine Hall, are also, they're good. They're good in the movie. A bit annoying, but I think that's just the character. That's just how they're done. I mean, the characters and that's also kind of a staple to screwball comedies to a certain extent. The characters aren't that deep, but they're meant to get the comedy going. They're meant to bring the laughs. So and this is especially for the time too, they're meant to be a little broad to a certain extent. And when it comes to writing these characters, it's not that deep. But for a comedy, especially of this type, it's good. It's pretty good. Let's get into writing. The writing is good. When the dark subject matter happens, I think it's pretty good. When the romance stuff happens is when it kind of falls apart, because they kind of go into, and again, this is the time, this is just how it is, but they go into the more stereotypical love interest, lovey-dovey, just getting married tropes that they have, except for the main character was an author who pretty much shit on people who got married, and which is a detail that I guess looking back was just not necessary, but it's fine. it's a common trope in those movies, especially back then, where the new husband was just not sure and really didn't want to get married, but he got married anyway because he loved the girl, even though he detests the thought of actually getting married and hates the idea of it. That's kind of a trope. So, again, not incredibly deep with the writing. The dark comedy is good, but the lighter aspects, not so hot in this. And of course, Frank Capra's direction is very good. The way he frames a shot, the way he gets the scene started. The whole movie is basically in a house. And I never was really bored, or the film never felt like it was dragging at times. So the way that it's directed to be not plotting, but a quippy kind of fast-paced, not fast-paced, but a briskly paced film is pretty good for the movie itself. It's not one of my favorite Capra films. It Happened One Night, I think, will always be my favorite Capra. I know a lot of people are going to say It's a Wonderful Life is probably his best, which, sure, that's a good one. Some might say Mr. Smith Goes to Washington. Others might, well, I don't think anyone would say You Can't Take That With You, but it's on its IMDb. It's a good Capra film. It's not his best, but I know, I understand, I do understand, though, why people like this film. I understand why people have affection for it. Because it is, especially for its time, it is a very different film. And I can appreciate that. I can. Like, it's, for what it is, for the type of dark comedy it's going for, it is good. But he has better films. And I guess I will put it this way. If you really like screwball comedies, and you really like dark comedies, I would say you would actually really enjoy this film. But that's the thing I have with this movie, is like, I don't know a lot of people that I could recommend that to, because usually people who are into dark comedies don't like the lighthearted affairs. You know, they don't. If they're into, let's say, Coen Brothers or In Bruges or something like that, it's kind of hard to say, hey, you know what? Bring Up Baby is a good movie, because they'll look at you like, I don't like those type of movies. I like my humor biting. I like it dark. I like it semi-serious, kind of fucked up. It is kind of a weird mix that this film does with the screwball and the dark, but it works. It actually, it kind of works, isn't it? It's not his best film, not by a long shot, but it is a fun film. It's enjoyable. So yeah, like, if you are into dark comedies, and if you're also one of those people who are into screwball comedies, like, give it a shot if you like both. But if you like one or the other, I think it would be an interesting watch, just to watch like an old movie like this and see the directions they go. I think in that kind of interesting way, it would be an interesting watch. But I'm not entirely sure if I would recommend it to somebody who like really loves screwball comedies, or someone who really loves dark comedies. That's the thing. Like, I mean, I would say it's a good movie, but for someone who likes just one of those, it would be kind of hard to actually recommend that, even though I do think it's a good movie. So, yeah, it's only complicated in the way of who I would recommend it to, but I do think it's a good movie that if you're interested in it, especially like Cary Grant, you know, give it a watch. It is pretty fun. I had a good time.